was called away this morning to deal with the lovely wildfire in the Gros Ventre that I think we are all well aware of. So we're missing him and sending all of that team really good thoughts. But I want to start out by setting a little context, because there's a little bit of a joke in Jackson that us locals think that the world revolves around us. And I won't necessarily comment on the sentiment of that joke, but in a lot of ways we are at the epicenter, a confluence of sorts. If you look around, 97% of the land that you see is public lands. We're home to some of the longest ungulate migrations in the lower 48. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is some of the largest intact and most complex ecosystems in the world. And we also see over 4 million non-residents pass through this landscape on a yearly basis. And that creates an average daily population. So that includes residents, non-residents, workers, visitors, basically anyone who's on our landscape in this county at a given time at about 56,000. So if you take a snapshot in time and pause and count everybody who's here, we average around 56,000 people. So when we're talking here, we're talking about a really big tension between two opposing forces, a limited and wild landscape and a booming population. And so what happens when there's a disruption to that landscape? This year, our season has been started with a major road failure on Teton Pass, which was a main artery for workers and visitors coming over from the west into the valley. And as you all see, as I mentioned, it's now bookended by a raging and growing wildfire. And so natural disasters, migrating species, snow levels, they don't care about whose jurisdiction the land is under, or commute times, or the complexity of explaining road closures to road tripping tourists. But tourism is the lifeblood of this community. Travel and tourism supports over 8,000 local jobs and produces enough sales and lodging tax revenue that without the tourism industry, locals would have to pay almost $10,000 additional per person in taxes each year to maintain the current level of services that the taxes pay for. Those 4.5 million visitors that we're expecting to see in 2024 alone have also helped to produce over $1 billion in economic revenue for surrounding communities. So, yeah, saying that we're the epicenter, at the epicenter is pretty accurate. And if this all sounds fairly complicated, good, it is. Because when that level of travel and tourism is left unmanaged or uncoordinated, I fear that the effects that could take place would be irreversible. Managing tourism to decrease its impacts on the environment, on natural resources, and on infrastructure is an all-hands job across multiple local and federal agencies. Bridger-Teton National Forest is 4.5 million acres large, spanning 5 counties in Wyoming, and is the size of Massachusetts. This I stole actually from Chad Hudson, because it's the best visual that I could find that really shows the scope of the Bridger-Teton National Forest. Yellowstone, which is in your upper left, almost 2 Yellowstone National Parks can fit into one Bridger-Teton National Forest. And it's a good chance that most visitors will step foot on the BTNF at some point during their visit to the county. But Grand Teton and Yellowstone are often the draw of people to come here. It's a bucket list destination, and that's primarily in the summer months. They also primarily have the most touch points to those visitors through things like their rangers and the gates, the entry gates. And then the Jackson Hole community, that little dot on the west side, the left side of your screen, shoulders much of the burden of providing the infrastructure, the workforce, the services to all those people who visit. Which brings us to the intention of this panel. I've been lucky enough to work with the federal land management partners who are responsible for managing that 97% of the natural assets that surround us to ideate what effective management looks like, not just in theory, but in practice. These conversations are complex, interconnected, and constantly evolving. And today we'll be having one of those conversations, real time, diving into the complexity of visitation and visitor use management, the changes that we're seeing on the ground and what to expect in the future, and the impacts of visitation, what we collectively have learned, and maybe some of those areas we need to continue to lean into. So I'll start by introducing our panel. Next to me is Mr. Cam Sholly. He assumed duties as the Yellowstone Superintendent in October 2018. Cam is a third-generation Park Service manager and began his National Park Service career in 1990 in Yellowstone's backcountry. During his tenure as superintendent, the park has set strategic priorities that focus on supporting the Yellowstone workforce, strengthening the Yellowstone ecosystem, delivering a world-class visitor experience, investing in infrastructure, and building coalitions and partnerships. At the end, we have John Bowers. He's the Jackson Hole Travel and Tourism Board's marketing manager and has called Jackson home for almost 10 years. His strong expertise in marketing and working with best-in-class brands to produce impactful messaging and go-to-market campaigns through storytelling, photo, and video production, and product marketing has taken him across the West, working with a variety of brands. His background includes 7 years working on brand and content marketing with Jackson Hole Mountain Resort and Protect Our Winters before starting his own company, Bowers West, focused on marketing and producing content across multiple industries. And in the center, Chip Jenkins, Superintendent of Grand Teton National Park and the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Memorial Parkway. Chip has more than 38 years of experience working in and leading national parks. His experience includes working in 8 national parks, 2 regional offices, NPS headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the Office of the Secretary of the Interior. So I keep forgetting I have a screen right there. We're gonna have time for some Q&A at the end. I'm also happy to and willing to work in some of your questions during the panel. So if you have your phone, you can scan this in, and I will have the questions sent directly to me. And then at the end, we'll choose a few or we'll work them into the conversation. So feel free to scan that, ask questions, and we'll go from there. So to start warming, I'll start with a softball to warm us up. Can one of you define what visitors are and what visitation means?
I think the way to what I would suggest is actually to take the idea of visitors and use a different word, has a different kind of meaning. I'd say customers. So think about in terms of people who are coming. They're coming for a range of purposes, but they're here to be able to seek experiences and seek services that are meaningful to them. So, and I think visitors have a lot more meaning to it. The range of visitation is quite broad, but I think kind of in the context of particularly working with other organizations, kind of think about it in terms of people who, we want them to have a really good time. We want them to be able to be support of public lands. We want them to understand and support what it is that we're doing, and we want them to come back.
Do you have different user groups that you break down between those?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I mean, we have, I would say, a vast majority of people who are visitors to at least to Grand Teton National Park. They're people who are coming here who are, they are seeking inspiration. They are seeking things in terms of they want to get together with family and friends to be able to have an awesome experience that helps feed their soul. I think there are people who are coming here who are seeking to be educated. They're seeking to learn something about our country, learn something about our common heritage. There are people who are coming here who are trying to make a living. I mean, there are people who are in really different ways. I think there are folks they're photographers who are trying to use the landscape in order to be able to have images that they're able to sell. We have people who are phenomenal athletes who are looking at being on the landscape as a way to be able to seek sponsorship and to be able to make a living in terms of being able to pursue their passions. And we have entrepreneurs who are working to create and operate businesses that support people coming here. So it's the range of visitors is actually quite broad, quite diverse, and it's not unusual that the interests of those visitors are not in sync and sometimes in conflict.
Yeah. So do you find, and these are all questions to the group, of course, do you find that you are communicating to those different user groups or those different types of visitors differently and have different expectations of those different groups?
Yeah, I would say, think about 1948 was the first year Yellowstone had 1 million people in it in a single year. 1965 was the first year we had 2 million in Yellowstone in a single year. 92 was 3 million for the first time. 2015 was 4 million. 2021 was almost 5 million. So we'd historically had the luxury of 15 to 20 years between each additional million. And that time frame is shrinking. We'll hit probably 4.7 million this year. We do share quite a bit of visitation, obviously. The comment about Jackson being the epicenter, what I would say is no matter where you are is the epicenter. Cody thinks they're the epicenter. West Yellowstone thinks they're the epicenter. Gardner thinks they're the epicenter. Right. Bozeman thinks they're the epicenter. So to answer your question, what I would suggest is the expectations have changed dramatically. First of all, Yellowstone's 2.2 million acres. As Crista said, 2 million acres are pavement. 97% of the people never get more than a half mile away from their car. And so most of that park never sees a visitor. The narrative that the parks are being overrun by people is true, but only in a very small percentage. That percentage has to be managed. And just like a city or a county, we've got 23 water and wastewater systems. We treated over 200 million gallons of drinking water for visitors last year. We've got a visitation trend going this way, a staffing trend going this way. That delta is impact on workforce, on our ability to protect the park effectively. And, there's ways that we've got to come together to figure out how to close that gap, either lower visitation commensurate with our financial capacities, staffing capacities, or increase revenues commensurate with the visitation levels. Those are really the two choices that we have. And so if you want to have a really good time, go to Cody or West Yellowstone, start talking about implementing reservation systems and things like that. We're coming along, but there's no question that the public expectations, Crista, to answer your question, are quite different now than they were in the 1960s when we were feeding grizzly bears out of garbage dumps.
Yeah.
I would say.
John, so you're the main manager of all of Visit Jackson Hole, from the Visit Jackson Hole website to social media, Instagram, et cetera. And I know that you spend, we were talking about this morning, hours and hours looking at how people move around the site and what they're clicking on, what they're sharing, what they're looking for. What are you seeing as some of the trends of the type of information people are looking for or are most interested in?
Yeah, excuse me. We focus a lot of our marketing on the dreaming and planning phase. And because of that, we curate a lot of our content for the dreaming and planning phase. What we see a lot is people arrive in Jackson. It's unlike anywhere else they've been. And I call it, they turn on their Disneyland head, where they forget kind of how to act, how to navigate, and how to be in a place. So what we've found is a lot of snackable content, whether it's 5 things to do, locals guides, itineraries, really work well for showing someone how to navigate Jackson before they even place foot here.
I think that's really interesting because to your point, Cam, I was just up in Yellowstone a couple of weeks ago, and knowing we were having this panel, was paying a lot of attention of the way people moved or experienced the park. And you're right. I mean, most people venture less than a mile from the roadway or their car. And so where are you, if you're not seeing the impacts on the backcountry, and if a lot of the information you're putting out is a lot of this snackable 5 things to do, kind of quick trip stuff, where are you seeing the impacts?
Well, I think, first of all, the question really should be phrased in two different ways. What are the expectations of the visitors?
Yeah.
70% of which are our first-time visitors, at least to Yellowstone. It's a bucket list trip. And then the second part of that's what are the expectations of the locals, the employees, and the repeat visitors who know exactly where they want to go. They know exactly how long it should take them. They've seen thousands of bison. They've seen hundreds of grizzlies in their life. And they're stopped behind someone who hasn't seen any of that. And they're mad. And they're frustrated. And, Chip made a comment earlier about reconciling the opinions of someone who lives in Jackson or West or Cody or Gardner or Cook City or wherever, local, versus someone that lives in Chicago or New York. And when they come here, we had a major survey done in July this year, 98.1% good to excellent visitor satisfaction rating. And because they're getting to see what they wanted to see. It's not their fault that the Park Service didn't build shoulders on the roads. So when they see that bison or they see that grizzly, they're going to stop and they're having a good time. The locals that are 20 cars back sitting there aren't having a good time. And, so we've got to reconcile those two things. And most of the people that come here haven't seen what we see on a daily basis in this area. That novelty may have worn off slightly for us, or it's normal for us to experience all these things. These are people, at least 70%, that have never experienced it. And that's why they came. And that's why the visitor satisfaction rating is so high. They're getting to see, there's a payoff for sitting in traffic, unlike on I-95 in DC or the 405 in LA or whatever the case is. They get to see a bison or a grizzly. Like, it was fine. It was fine to wait for 20 or 30 minutes in line. So we've got to figure that out. And there's only so much road mileage. There is a capacity of any of these parks. Chip and I have worked together for over 20 years. We started working together in Yosemite back in 2002. There was challenges in Yosemite at the turn of the century and other parks. Those challenges have become much more significant as time has gone on and visitation levels have gone up. But everything we do inside these parks affects what happens outside, and everything that happens outside affects what happens inside. So it's really important, and that fifth priority that Crista read off, building coalitions and partnerships. And if you look at the flood that happened in 22 or the COVID closures in 20, all the things that we've all done a lot of work together on is because we have good relationships and we've met a lot of the challenges of the past, and I guarantee you together we'll meet the challenges of the future as well.
Hey, Crista, could you do me a favor and go back on that, show them?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I think just something that might be relevant to folks who are from other mountain towns. So looking at this landscape, so Grand Teton National Park, our visitation is 95% of our visitation is from elsewhere in the country. 5% of our visitation is from Teton County. Our highest level of visitation, California, 10%, Texas, 10%. Twice as much as what comes from Teton County. And our buddy Chad, who's the supervisor of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, he has a different dynamic. 75% of his visitation on the forest is local. So 5% is local to Grand Teton, 75% is local to the National Forest, right? So there's this, and I would dare say that 98% of the comments that we get when we do planning, 98% of the public input that we get come from that 5%. And to Cam's point, that the way the 5%, the way that we who are locals use this landscape is really, really different than the way people from the rest of the country. We know that we're trying to get to the resort in terms of the parking lot at a certain time, or we're trying to get up to Lupin Meadows because we want to get up the canyon before the crowd starts, or we want to get up onto the lake and go paddling. The vast majority of people who are coming on this landscape to recreate, they're just going along in slack jaw wonder and just kind of picking up, oh my God, that's spectacular. I'm going to pull over and take a photo. And they're moving through this landscape in a very different way than locals do. And that creates an interesting tension.
So how do you balance then that local sentiment and public comment when trying to make decisions?
Yeah.
Well, everybody's got an opinion, and everyone's opinion's right. And I think, you want from us collaborative, smart decision makers with the primary focus protecting those places. There's a big part of our mission is obviously the enjoyment, which is kind of what we're talking about right now. But if we don't get the first part of that right, then the enjoyment part doesn't really matter. And so I think it's up to us to make the case with you about things that we want to try or propose to balance that protection of these parks with the use of the parks at the same time, understanding that not everybody's going to be in agreement. So you do the best job that you can. Frankly, the relationships, and I see a lot of friends in this room that I've worked with over the last 6 years. I've been here 6 years this week, which is crazy. And we've been through a lot. And I think having those foundational relationships builds a lot of trust and can help solve problems that maybe if you didn't have those relationships would be more difficult.
John, I know that you sit in a lot of these conversations where you're hearing both sides, taking phone calls, sitting in working groups from businesses, our federal and management partners, locals. What is it that you're hearing, and how do you take that to produce information and communications to the public that takes into account maybe some of those gripes or challenges or pain points, while also mixing it with pretty photos and things that people want to consume?
Yeah, we do a lot of work talking with different organizations, different groups. Chip and I are on a bunch of groups together, really understanding what those key messages are based on the time of year. And we put a lot of effort into creating cohesive messaging that it sounds the same, whether it's coming from the parks, whether it's coming from locals, whether it's coming from a nonprofit organization. Taking all of those tidbits on a certain topic, reframing it to a way that's really understandable for the visitor, and then putting it out in a way that they can understand. So it's hard to get everyone's opinion, obviously, in it, but you find pretty quickly in places like this, there are common tones and common themes, and that's really what we lean into. And also provide resources to the other local community members so they can also have the tools to speak about some of these issues that we have, and also the resources and assets to do so as well. Because if we're talking about, let's say, wildlife, people getting too close to wildlife, everyone's going to have a different way to speak about it. But the more cohesive we can get, the more that visitor's going to hear the same messaging, and the more it's going to kind of go into their head as they're here or before they get here, and hopefully change behavior.
Yeah.
And also remember that there's a lot of different dynamics in every one of these communities. Mm-hmm. So you could have 50% of the visitation in Yellowstone comes through the west entrance. So you can have a 5-mile backup in the morning of the rush hour coming into the west corridor, and no cars in line at east coming from Cody. And so you might have a community like Jackson, which is kind of now trying to figure out, do we have enough? Do we want more or not? You've got communities like West probably in that same situation. You got communities like Cook City or Cody that are like, we want more. And so the conversation is not necessarily the same across the board. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Everybody's got a different epicenter, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and something with the tourism industry is we really measure that numbers of enough, too much, balance, et cetera, and lean a lot into looking at occupancy percentage. So what is your occupancy year over year, month over month? How are you tracking? But what I found interesting is that because 97% of our land, of our county, is public lands, you all have a capped occupancy. You can't have more room nights or bed nights. You have or bedrooms or hotels. You have a capped season. And so really 90% of our potential lodging is capped. And really we're looking at the occupancy percentage of just the Jackson Hole area, right? And so I don't think always looking at occupancy percentage to track how you're doing over time, at least from a tourism perspective, is a really good metric, because I don't think it tells a really comprehensive story. And so I'll open it up to you three of, in your opinions, what other metrics should we be tracking, and what other metrics really matter in helping to tell that story?
Go ahead.
There's kind of 4 areas that we focus on. Number 1 is what are the impacts of visitation and increasing visitation on the resources of Yellowstone. You want to know that, what the impacts on habitat are, wildlife species, geysers, whatever the case might be. That's one bucket. 2 is what are the impacts on staffing, operations, and infrastructure. So what I mentioned, no one thinks about what's it take to empty 2,000 garbage cans 4 times a day instead of 2, or clean 700 bathrooms 3 times a day instead of 1. Those are like real impacts that, you can measure and you can use to see if that staffing capacity I mentioned earlier is equivalent to the service levels that you want to provide. Number 3 is what are the impacts on visitor experience? What do the visitors want to see? The reason we did the survey this last July is in 2018 we did a survey, a very comprehensive survey. That was a 4 million visitor a year. This year we thought was going to get close to 5, so we asked the exact same questions that we did in 2018, thinking, okay, there's going to be a big shift in visitor opinions between a 4 million visit year and a 5 million visit year. Guess what? There wasn't. And we did the survey in the busiest parts of the park. We did it at Grand Prismatic in the North Rim of the Grand Canyon. I thought we'd get our butts kicked on it, and the visitor satisfaction rating went up. So that one's a hard one to gauge, and what we've found out is that what we think visitors think isn't always what they think. And then that 4th bucket is what are the impacts on the gateway communities? Economically, recreational access wise, and that kind of thing. And what I would say, Crista, to you is, I agree that looking at occupancy ratings here in Jackson is not necessarily the best metric. However, Chip makes this point on a regular basis. You can look at Bozeman, you can look at Victor, Driggs. You're seeing that capacity for occupancy growing substantially. So I don't know where you draw that line, but I would suggest in the last decade there are significantly more places to stay for visitors, say within 50 miles of this place or even further, than there are today. And so I don't think there's a perfect science to it, but I do think focusing on those 4 areas and the right metrics within them can kind of bring you to some logical conclusions for the future, which is, we need to take short-term actions to address some of these visitation increases and impacts, and we're going to need to work on long-term strategies together as well.
It is a dilemma because we are, Grand Teton at least is fundamentally a day-use park. 85% of our visitors come from outside the park. And generally speaking, people are traveling up to 2 hours to come to Grand Teton. So people are coming from Idaho Falls, they're coming from Riverton, they're coming from Pinedale. They're coming from a large distance. And, when you add, if you figure average occupancy of 3 people per hotel room, when you add 300 hotel rooms, you're adding 1,000 people a day on the landscape. And you mentioned that Jackson Hole has about 56,000 people a day that come into Jackson Hole. So about 25,000 people come in and out of Grand Teton every day during the summer. And then they're traveling, as I said, up to two hours away. So looking at occupancy rates, I think you need to look at a pretty large geographic area. I think what we are concerned about is that as we are seeing, traffic volumes increase on roads, we're starting to see that the volume of traffic on roads are starting to be barriers for wildlife. We're starting to see, we're seeing that development, particularly fencing, is a barrier to wildlife. So some of the very things that people are traveling from around the world to be able to come here and see, pronghorn, deer, elk, bison, and then the things that feed on those, grizzly bears, wolves, right, are going to be, they are affected, and they are going to be increasingly affected by more development on the landscape, more traffic on the landscape. So what's the metric? Absolutely, we have to be looking at economics, right? People have to make payroll. They have to be able to pay the rent. They have to be able to, put food on the table. But in addition to that, I think we also need to be looking at the characteristics of the ecosystem. And the challenge is occupancy rate, you may be looking at 30, 90 days. When you're looking at ecosystem, you're looking at 5, 10 years. And so it's that temporal discontinuity that creates a challenge for us.
I think it's important to have, there's an intangible buzz that happens when there's people here, and you can kind of feel it when you live in a place like this. I think that's important to keep a pulse on as well, in addition to all of the tangible numbers.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Chip, you mentioned that from an ecological standpoint, and from what I've learned working with the feds, you all do look 5, 10, 30 years down the road. When you're looking at that future thinking, what are you taking into consideration? What are you looking at? What are you considering?
Yeah, it is, again, just kind of interesting conversations with the local communities, because for very good reasons, right? They're right now, people are thinking about what the occupancy rate looks like in December, January, and February, right? I think we're thinking about what does a growth curve of 3% increase in visitation mean to us in 5 years, right? We're thinking about our wastewater treatment plants, our staffing levels. We're thinking about the numbers of vehicles per hour that move along certain roads. At what point does that start to create a barrier that wildlife won't move along? And we're thinking about it in terms of projects and planning that are on a 5 and 10 year time scale.
What are some effective strategies that you've seen to reduce the impacts of recreation? And on the flip side, strategies that maybe have not worked or haven't worked as well as you wish they would?
I'll talk about. We could go any number of ways here.
This one's from the audience, so.
Oh, good.
Cool.
So first off, in Yellowstone, it's been last 5 years, very, very extensive monitoring of different types of species within the road corridors, within the trail corridors in the front country, areas that we're seeing the biggest impacts. And then microgeographic management actions to prevent or protect those areas where we're seeing the highest impacts. There's also kind of some basic things that we weren't doing, like in the west corridor. If anybody's been on the west corridor coming from west and you see a single bison, traffic can back up for 6 miles. Anybody been in that situation on the west corridor? So we put a traffic management unit actually into the west corridor, and their whole job is to manage that visitor-wildlife interface. Remember, Yellowstone's got the biggest wildlife and visitor interface in the world. So you can go to Africa and see more wildlife, but no people. Go to Alaska, maybe see more wildlife, more people. You can go plenty of places, see more people, and no wildlife. Here in Yellowstone, you got both. And so we weren't necessarily allocating the staffing in the right locations. Were we putting staffing in Hayden Valley during the bison rut because traffic was backed up 3 miles in each direction when the bison are in the road? And they don't really care about cars. Are we effectively managing it in Hayden Valley or at Norris Geyser Basin or at Grand Prismatic or any of those things? And if you go to a NFL football game or pick a venue, you've got people that bring all the cars in, and then at the end of the game, you got people that help the cars get out. We weren't doing that at, say, Norris Geyser Basin, so we didn't. Don't ask me why we weren't, but so we've taken some of those short-term, what I would call short-term actions that are pretty common sense to try to manage the visitor interface better. Long-term, we just finished a shuttle feasibility study. I don't know if you've got a question in there on shuttles, because that one always comes up.
There is one, yeah. You can.
So I'll just hit that real quick. So we did a feasibility. Who thinks a shuttle system in Yellowstone's 475 miles of road is a good idea? Wow. I usually get like a ton of hands. That's what happens when you're sitting in the epicenter, I guess. So we did it, and here's what we found is that We studied it from Old Faithful to west, so the busiest corridor in the park. For everybody that says don't develop anything more in Yellowstone, we would have needed to build a 600 space, an additional 600 space parking lot at Madison, a 600 space parking lot, additional parking lot at Old Faithful, 13 shuttle stops, garage so the shuttles could get worked on, housing for the mechanics, the drivers, the dispatchers, probably a $60 to $70 million capital investment on top of a $10 to $14 million operating cost every year. And if I ask 10 people in here, what's your favorite thing about Yellowstone? You're going to say, I like to watch birds. I like to go to Lamar and watch wolves. I want to go to Norris and I want to wait there for like 15 days for Steamboat Geyser to go off, whatever the case is. And in the thousands, literally thousands of conversations I have with people, I found that people want to go where they want to go. They want to stop for as long as they want to stop, and they want to see what they want to see. And how do you do that on a shuttle system? You know, you want to fish 5 different locations on the Madison Firehole rivers. You know, you pull the string and the bus stops and you get off with your diaper bags and strollers, and hopefully you can get another shuttle. So it's probably not the most effective thing for Yellowstone. There are parks like Zion where it makes total sense because of the geography. You know, there's, I think, 42 miles of road in Zion. Acadia, I think you could fit 50 Acadias in Yellowstone. And so the solutions aren't necessarily the same for every park. Whether that's timed entry, reservation systems, or you name it, we're kind of figuring this out as we go. What we've committed to, and we speak regularly together, is what the public doesn't want is 2 different systems if we ever get to something for Yellowstone and Grand Teton. You don't want to have, here's Teton's system, and then here's mine. We want to be in sync. And so anything that we do together, because we do share visitation, or anything we do in the future is going to have to be done together. That's really going to be important.
Would you ever consider capping visitation or number of people who come into your parks or come into the valley?
I think this turn.
Yeah, so what I'll say is, interesting thing, we have all sorts of caps on visitation. We cap the number of people who can spend a night in Grand Teton. We have a cap on the number of campgrounds and the number of people who can stay in each spot. We have a cap on the number of hotel rooms, the number of people who can stay in each of the hotels. Okay. We have a cap on the number of backcountry people who can be in the backcountry overnight through our permit system. We have a cap on the number of people climbing overnight. We have a cap on number of concession guided climbs, the cap of on concession float trips, fishing guided trips. We have all sorts of caps, and they've been in place for years to decades. Actually, it was 1971 when the cap on overnight accommodations in Grand Teton was established. We also have caps on that we manage to for day visitors in some places. The Lawrence Rockefeller Reserve, we manage to the size of the parking lot there. If the parking lot is full, you don't park. You can wait in line, and when one car leaves, then you can park. Same thing at String Lake. We manage to the size of the parking lot at String Lake. We manage that one differently. It's predatory parking, right? You can orbit the parking lot, looking for the like a grizzly looking for a calf in the spring, and when the parking lot opens up, you pounce on the parking lot. Will we look at yes, we are going at some point in time. Is that 5 years from now? Is it 10 years from now? Is it 15 years from now? In terms of other kinds of caps on day visitors in Grand Teton? No doubt we will get there. It's kind of what does that trajectory look like, and what does it mean? The geography of Grand Teton, the geography of Yellowstone, really, really different than Yosemite Valley, really different than Zion, really different than the Going to the Sun Highway. So it may make sense to use Cam's turn, work on the microgeographic area as opposed to on the park-wide area. But I'll also say, I think one of the things that Jackson Hole, I think we need to do a better job of, and frankly, I think other mountain towns need to do a better job of, which is throughout your towns, you have all sorts of caps, and you use all sorts of different strategies to manage those. You have a capacity in terms of how many flights come into your airport based upon the capacity of your airport. You have capacity. Jackson Hole Mountain Resort is managing to a finite capacity of number of skiers a day. They're going to be doing that for the 5th year in a row. And they use a variety of strategies and a very sophisticated system in terms of how they manage for that day use. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. Rental cars, anybody who runs a restaurant, you got a cap on the number of, on the amount of people that you serve. Golf courses, on a golf course, you don't sit there and put 2 foursomes on the same hole at the same tee off at the same time. I mean, there's all sorts of places where we have caps on how we engage in what we're doing for the day. We just may not recognize that those are there, or we've become so socialized to them. But the idea of what does that mean in terms of public lands or a larger geography, we're still working through how we apply those lessons learned in all sorts of other industries.
Mm-hmm. John, this one might be for you mostly. What, in your opinion, is the most effective way to communicate with our guests to drill home the message of stewardship?
I think an effective way to do it is to present the stewardship idea in more than one way. So whether they're receiving and learning from a lot of different avenues, it has an undertone of stewardship and it has a common theme, whether the header theme might be different, but the common theme below it is very consistent. It's really hard for someone who's coming to Jackson to read one thing and understand that and take it and hold on to it for their whole trip. It's a lot of, they might read it, they might see it, and they might forget it. It's how many times can they see it and read it and understand it. And I think having, stewardship as a sub-theme come through on a lot of what we're doing or a lot of what the community is doing really drives home for people before they get here.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left, and I have one final question. So this session was named Reducing the Environmental Impacts of Tourism, but in so many of our previous conversations, including this one, we've danced around this idea of reducing impacts, noting that reducing might not be the right goal or word or focus of this work. So because, and a big reason for that is humans on landscapes cause impacts. So what do you feel might be a better word than reducing?
Understanding, because I think that it does need to be reduced in certain areas. I think if you look at how far we've come, I mentioned the grizzly bears being fed in garbage dumps, in the 60s. We killed every wolf 100 years ago. We decimated the grizzly population, bison. We've all done a really good job of, and this is for decades, of rebuilding this ecosystem. Chip and I sit on the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, which is all the 5 national forest supervisors, both of us. We've got the state game and fish directors on that committee, in addition to BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service. And as you saw at the conference we were at in Big Sky last month, Chip's the chair currently, but the GYCC is really working on GYE, a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem-wide assessment to really understand in various critical areas, wildlife corridors or habitat or water quality, you name it. How are we doing? Do we understand where some of the biggest challenges and threats and impacts are occurring? And on a larger landscape, he knows in Tetons, I might know in Yellowstone, Chad might know in the BT, but on a larger landscape, are we all kind of using the same metrics and understanding so we can all have a conversation about what the condition of the GYE is and what types of actions are necessary, whether it's the federal land managers or communities, to address those impacts wherever they are. Just this assumption that everything's bad and everything is being impacted negatively, I think is false. It's clearly happening in certain areas, but I think we all need to be focused on much, much bigger, large landscape conservation efforts, and understanding what those impacts are is critical.
Any other answers?
I think along with understanding, I'd say dissecting, really digging into what those impacts are and where the solutions are from them.
I'll take it just a little bit different than answering that question specifically. I think what we need to focus on is stewardship. And as we talked about in Big Sky, it's really, really easy for humans. It's really easy for me to sit there and say, I think you ought to do something different. I think you ought to ride a shuttle bus so I can drive. I think we need to be having conversations about what I'm willing to do. I think we need to be focusing on what I'm willing to change and use that language about as being a steward of wherever it is that you live. What is it that I'm willing to do to try to conserve and preserve the values of this place so that I can demonstrate to other folks what's possible, what our values, what it looks like in terms of living on the land, and having thriving communities. I mean, people need to be able to make payroll. They need to be able to have schools that you want to have your kids go to. You want to be able to have social institutions that be able to bind together the social fabric. We also need wild spaces, and we need these iconic animals. We need clean water. We need to be able to fish. We need to be able to be out and do things on the landscape that feeds our soul. And in that conversation, I think if we can change that language and be thinking about what is it I'm willing to do to try to be able to preserve that place, then maybe we'll start to trend on the right track.
I think that's a great way to wrap up. Thank you all. Thank you for listening. We'll be here. We'll step outside if you have any questions. But thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Crista.